So, as I said, I'd like to ask you about early influences that may have predisposed you to psychosynthesis.
I can think of a few that would at least have predisposed me towards a spiritual orientation in any field I was in, and then some that would predispose me towards psychology in any case. The earliest influence probably on me in those regards is that my name is Dorothy. It means gift of God, they told me over and over again, for better and worse. But more important than that was that I am named after my aunt, my great aunt, who was a missionary in what is now Iraq. It was not at the time. She did a lot of work with Arab women and girls and brought reading into the country. And this was in probably the early 30s. I discovered very recently, in fact right after my cousin John Firman died, a poem she wrote called Imminence, which was a fairly amazing poem. She wrote it when she was at Mount Holyoke College in maybe 1920.
Oh, thanks.
And so I had that lineage that was there for me from the beginning, and somehow I was also always a traveler of sorts. When I was very young, 12, I convinced my parents why on earth they said yes to let me go to Europe by myself.
When you were 12.
They found people for me to stay with, but I just got it in my head that I should go to Europe, and so they found families for me to stay with, and one was in Switzerland. And in the mountains of Switzerland, I had what I would consider to be my first transpersonal experience, which was brought about by some amount of loneliness in that the family I was with didn't speak much English, but it was also in the glory of the Swiss Alps, and so those are the things that I think of as you ask that question, and I've not much thought of it before.
Right. That's really, really interesting, Didi.
Yeah.
So how did you meet, and when did you meet psychosynthesis?
I met psychosynthesis through John Firman, my cousin. He came to Amherst, I don't know, a million years ago, to do a workshop at what was then, I think it was then so-called the Institute for Holistic Education. I was living in North Amherst with a young child, so it must have been, my son is 39, so it must have been 37, 38 years ago. So John came to stay with us when he was doing this workshop, and so I asked him what it was about. I was in a BA program at the time, and he did a guided imagery with me, just to give me an experiential taste of it. It worked. I was hooked. I followed him to Pennsylvania, did my first workshop with him in Pennsylvania, and then never stopped. Turned my degree program into one that studied psychosynthesis, among other things, and then just kept chugging along forever after.
Right. Good for you.
So it has been.
So how were you predisposed to psychology? You mentioned that.
I think I was predisposed to psychology in some ways, also because of the name. And then I was the youngest child in a family, and I was the kind of an organizer kid in the neighborhood, but at least part of the message was to be helpful, as a gift of God, to be a peacemaker. So at least until my adolescence, I was trying that on, and then in my adolescence and young adulthood, I took on kind of a larger social consciousness, and the two came together as an inclination towards psychology.
And would you say that's largely what's kept you involved? Is there something else?
I wouldn't say that my history has kept me largely involved. My experience in present time from the beginning of my work in the field has kept me involved, because it still feels alive and pertinent, and it's nice to go to bed at night feeling like I have done good work in the world, that's what keeps me in it. Still to this day, and every year I ask myself, again? Do I want to do this again? And every year the answer is yes.
You do that once a year or every morning?
No, once a year. Like when I have to think, probably it's more like once every 2 years when I have to decide whether to run a psychosynthesis training program again.
Right.
And I don't just do it as a pro forma thing because I can. I really do ask the question, is it still a calling? Does it still feel pertinent? Do I still love it? And I do.
Yeah, that's beautiful, really. And Didi, how would you say that your understanding of what psychosynthesis is has changed over time? How has it changed?
In a very core way, it hasn't changed. And I am fond of saying to my trainees, I'm not a theoretician. I am a psychotherapist. So while I teach psychosynthesis and I actually think about it theoretically, I'm not so inclined to worry the details of where the star is on the egg diagram, because the larger principles, I think, hold from the beginning. And then, of course, I started studying psychosynthesis before I'd studied any other psychology, and since then I've gone on to study lots and lots of theory, and as a professor of psychology, I continue to access and study and have to understand more and more theory and psychology. And in that regard, psychosynthesis has never felt challenged to me by any other theory, while I bring in a lot of other theories under the umbrella of psychosynthesis, because psychosynthesis doesn't have a hugely comprehensive technology. Its theory has always been the largest and most comprehensive and holds the most of any theory I've worked with. So I bring in a lot of stuff that is in service of psychosynthesis theory. And what has changed, I think, in psychosynthesis more than the specifics of theory, and there has been some change, is that we now have some highly academic writing, and that is what in the field of psychology you need. So Firman and Gila's books have just put us on the map in a way that nothing had really before. And with a forthcoming journal out of the European Federation of Psychosynthesis on psychosynthesis, we're kind of more on the map in the field at large than we have been in the past. Several people teaching in colleges, things like that. So
that's really interesting. That makes me curious to know more about what you know that I don't know.
About what?
In terms of the journal and how you see that we're more on the map now.
The journal I have just found out about as this conference is coming in the last month or so, but there's a European Federation of Psychology or Psychotherapy, and they are doing, in preparation for the 2012 International Conference on Psychosynthesis in Rome, they are doing a journal, one of their issues dedicated to psychosynthesis. And so that's a piece in Europe. I mean, we know psychosynthesis in Europe already has a different orientation than it does here. It's a little more embedded in the culture, especially in Italy and England. Here in the United States, there's so many complementary, if you will, kinds of perspectives. But the other thing that I think is important about psychosynthesis to note, so much of psychosynthesis is now embedded in the field. When I started teaching, if I would say subpersonalities, people go, wow. And now everybody understands it. The whole field of positive psychology, which is, it's come on like it's the, it's the prodigal son. It's, it's so much of what we have always been working with. So that's, for me, that's a good thing. That the core and key elements are just in the field, implicit in the field now in ways that they haven't been in the past.
Okay, I've got to get reoriented here. Yes, did you ever meet Roberto Sacchioli?
I did not. I am one of the second generation.
Okay.
Never did.
it's hard to think of you that way. I think of you as one of the primary leaders, of course, in psychosynthesis in North America.
Well, I have certainly been lucky in that the work I've done has been well received, and the body of the Synthesis Center and the people involved have been full and carried through. But yep, I was trained with the people who trained with him.
So you trained with your cousin John Firman.
I actually never did train with him, other than that first workshop. Martha Crampton, I would say, was my primary teacher. I trained with the people from California who would come out here, and that was a wide variety of people. Tom and Ann, Yeomans, Harry Sloan. Marilyn Kriegel was my mentor in that she helped me with the first 5 years of the training program. Mark Horowitz. Those are some of the key people that were my primary trainers.
And those influences are still, as you said, pretty stable in your experience.
Yes, yes, and I'm pretty connected to those people who are still here amongst us, and I still have all my notes from my first trainings that I did, and they're in my files, neatly filed away, and I check back in with them. Paper's getting yellow.
You must have written in pen and not pencils.
I wrote in pen, but it was pre-computers. So.
This is a question that Vincent was curious about how the 7 core concepts have played out in your life, and have any of them been particularly important to you?
Are you meaning as in my theory of psychosynthesis and teaching, or in my personal life?
Both. Either or.
Well, let me start with, I can't remember the order you have them in, but let me start with the concept that is widely called disidentification. My first regret about that concept is that it's called disidentification when it's clearly defined by Assagioli as a process with 3 stages: identification, disidentification, and self-identification. Right. And I think that, we've sometimes gone a little astray, as have many spiritual techniques and meditative techniques on the disidentification side of it. Don't feel it, don't experience it, don't be it. Let's just get out of our body, feelings, mind, and hang out in the ethers. As somebody who's also a practitioner of Zen, disidentification and that process is a very familiar one to me, though I started psychosynthesis first. And so actually Zen comes to me through the lens of psychosynthesis rather than vice versa. Right. So disidentification for me is this process of getting it, whatever it is, a thought, a feeling, a subpersonality, a reaction, a physical sensation, all the psychological functions, getting it, owning it, stepping back from it, and knowing myself in a larger way. So that process to me is the most fundamental piece of work in psychosynthesis and in the world, and it is evolution as far as I'm concerned. We do it naturally. First we crawl, and we really get everything there is to know about crawling, and we're a crawler and we're fully identified with it. And then one day we stand up on the edge of a table and suddenly we disidentify from being a crawler, and sooner or later then what I think of as self-identification, not some abstract, now I'm in my I space, but now I'm a walker. And then I fully get into that identification until I learn to run and ride a bike, drive a car, fly a plane. So it's a forever process for me of that movement to larger and more comprehensive self.
Fully embodied.
Fully embodied, yes. But not just embodied if we think of the psychological functions, fully embodied, fully in our emotions, fully in our thinking, in our intuition, in our impulse desire, in our imagination. Knowing
you ran through that quickly.
Yeah, been teaching a long time. If I don't remember the 6 psychological functions, I'm in trouble. You can quiz me on the stages of the active will. I'll probably get those too.
That's great.
So that one for me is key. Concepts like the higher self, they're less evocative for me. I understand that the way I understand the whole self piece, what with the current debate on, is there a higher self at the top, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Has the star at the bottom, in the middle, and at the top.
That's good.
So for me, the way I think of the self is that it is the same self. If we envision it in the lower unconscious, it's the self in the dark night of the soul. If we envision it in the middle unconscious, it's the self at the kitchen sink. And if we envision it on the top of the egg diagram, it's the self on the mountaintop. Same self looking out in a different environment, in a different set of content, a different set of experiences. So I don't need it on the top of the egg, and I don't need it not to be there. I do think that the correction that John Firman was trying to make is one that I agree with, which is to move out of the hierarchy, to move out of what has been what is still, as far as I'm concerned, a huge problem in all of the Judeo-Christian, Muslim religions, probably other religions, I just don't know a lot about them. The dualism, yes, and the polarization of heaven in whatever variation you think of it, and earth, and the consequent objectification of the other. So by taking the star off the top of the diagram, or as we've done for a long time, having it on the bottom as well, then we stop having an assumption that there's a better and a worse, or there's a ladder to climb to get away from where we are now.
Right.
So for me, the self is very important as a concept.
Right. And it's beautiful, and I'm personally, this might need to be edited out, but I'm so happy to hear you articulating it so beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It's important to me because, in part because of my political orientation, my social consciousness, my work with, oppression and diversity, and those are the underpinnings. As long as there's a better and worse, and of course that takes me back to Zen, where, the basic assumption is no right and wrong. I'm not quite there, but, but yeah.
So, Didi, in terms of applications, psychosynthesis has been applied in so many different ways, and you've been primarily using it in psychotherapy. Is that still the case with you?
It's the place I most overtly use psychosynthesis, but again, for me, it's been a guiding principle in my life as a teacher. So I not only teach how to teach using psychosynthesis, but I use psychosynthesis to figure out how to teach. So I use it in my teaching and consulting. It also informs all of my writing. I've written some articles, some scholarly articles on psychosynthesis. I've not written a book that's about psychosynthesis, but the books I have written are all informed by psychosynthesis, and anyone reading them will see psychosynthesis language and concepts throughout, even though I'm not necessarily saying this is psychosynthesis, but I'm pointing it towards the theme that I'm working with.
Right. And what would you say that theme is? How would you call it? I know that's a asking you by using words to make it smaller than it actually is. But if you would point to a word that would describe your theme, what might that be?
Well, when I said theme before, what I was specifically referring to is when I write a book on mothers and daughters, I'm using psychosynthesis to inform that particular relationship.
Right.
When I co-wrote a book more recently on the flight that went down in the Hudson River, wow. Psychosynthesis informed all of our work too. The other person, my co-author, Kevin Quirk, is also trained in psychosynthesis. And so our interviews with the passengers, our framing of their experience, their near-death experience, was all framed through the lens of psychosynthesis. If there was a theme that informs everything I do, it is the kind of catchphrase we first put with psychosynthesis when we founded the Synthesis Center, which was conscious evolution. So for me, it's as simple as evolution is happening. That's, has nothing to do with me. It's happening. Right. I can either get with the program or not. And so conscious evolution is basically at personal, transpersonal, social, group levels. It is saying, given that there is a movement happening, how do I stay conscious and align my will with that?
Right, right.
Both so that I'm going with the flow and also so that I can support the flow in moving most effectively.
So then what you are saying also then with that is that it is unconscious action that helps to create the problems we experience.
For sure.
And
the relatively young and naive nature of the human being and the systems that are put in place and our nearness to a more primitive mammal life that is all about survival. So from where I sit, the worst of who we are is greed, but I see greed simply as the unconscious continuation of survival mechanisms that we have as animals. So it's a big issue. What's wrong with us, and also what's right with us.
Diagram as you've used it. Anything you wanted to say about the personal self or I?
So for me, that's the same. That's the same self. We can put a capital or no capital on it. And one of the ways I envision the egg diagram, interestingly, is actually with a hole in the middle, so that you've got that, and the hole in the middle goes then to what Ken Wilber calls the ground of being. So for me, the self is simply the ground of being as it is manifest in an individual life. And that's where we have transpersonal experiences or peak experiences. That's where we can connect to the universe in a larger way. That's where we can experience ourselves as being one with other human beings. And again, in the metaphor that I use, the self in the dark night of the soul, at the kitchen sink and on the mountaintop, it's the same experience in all of those places. It's just addressing something different. So in trauma or grief or loss, my experience of self is the same experience of self, but the content is painful. At the kitchen sink, the content is dishes. At the mountaintop, the content may be more blissful and pleasurable, but I'm looking through the same eyes.
Right. Beautiful. And then how does the will fit for you in that map that you've just described?
The will for me is the out-breath of and awareness is the in-breath. And that's, Assagioli defines those very clearly as the functions of I are awareness and will. So for me, in a very real way, it feels like the breath. And practically speaking, I teach it as with that metaphor of the breath, because psychology has for a very long time biased towards awareness. And so there's a lot of in-breaths, but if you do, if you take 3 or 4 in-breaths without an exhale, you're in trouble. And now we have in the field things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which are much more focused on the out-breath. And I think it's a balance in the field, but for me, that too is a problem. You can't have too much will without awareness. You can't have too many out-breaths without an in-breath. And there's a natural rhythm to taking in and putting out, taking in and putting out. And that's one of the things that I've been very aware of in my work, and especially, I don't know whether it came because I lived in this valley, but the whole history of Christianity in this area comes out of some real Puritan distortions. But one of the key pieces that came down literally in Northampton is there was a specific line which I'm not going to remember, but it had to do with if you touch God and you don't pass that on, then you haven't touched God. So it's not enough to take in the transpersonal, not enough to have awareness. That immediately requires action. And so then there's a whole history in spiritual traditions. Ram Dass did his Each One Teach One, a whole tradition of whatever I take in, I have to do something with. And we've seen these distortions in spiritual traditions too. And Ram Dass was a perfect example of going out into the world, finding out, nice Harvard professor doing his psychology thing and discovering LSD and bomb, the lights are flashing, and he decides he wants to stay there. And so he just figures he'll just take enough LSD to finally break through the veil of ego. And of course, 2 weeks later, exhausted and back in his body and his ego, he gets that he can't do it. And that begins him on his real spiritual path. And so for me, that's what awareness and will is. If it's an awareness about myself, I don't need 5 awarenesses about myself. I need one, and then I need to act on it. It's not to say I'm going to get it perfect, but when I realize, I go, oh yeah, I am impatient. Then if I don't practice patience, I don't need 5 more messages. I'll get them. I'll get them. But I don't need to go back into therapy and get another, round of, oh yes, now I understand why I'm impatient. I need to do something with that. And that's true at the social level. It's true in the, at every level. What I know, I need to act on. And so that's a bias for me in my therapy too. And Master Jolie talked about that too. He talked about false problems. If you've got an issue, if you're afraid of spiders, who cares? Unless you have to deal with spiders. So it's that. I don't know if he used that analogy of spiders, but he did talk about false problems. So for me, that's my bias in my work in therapy, that it's about moving on with your life. And having lived through, being in this field for so long, having lived through and worked through the early awareness of how much sexual abuse there was, and then the early stages of what that meant in the field of therapy, that too was, there have been alarming places for me watching the field, but that was one of them, because the first inclination was absolutely just uncovering memories, diving into the unconscious, unanchored to any ship, and people were hurt. And this was also true in the human potential movement, AST and places like that, where because we discovered these techniques of guided imagery, I've seen groups of people, 100 people lying on the floor going, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." And those are the people who ended up in my therapy office because the doors were open, but nobody was closing them, and there was no integration. It's become much clearer in the field, for instance, around sexual abuse, that if you have a recovered memory, you spend a long time working on integrating that. before you worry about, or if you ever worry about again, having to find more recovered memories. Mm-hmm. So that for me is awareness and will. That's what Assagioli said. His core map. When when people take that apart to the different concepts, as far as I'm concerned, it is one piece. It is a magnificent map in which in all of these years I have found nothing lacking in that core map. Lots of techniques to learn, cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, which again comes on the field as like, wow, look what we discovered. Mm-hmm. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. What you think affects how you behave, what your emotions are. These are Assagioli's psychological laws, the psychological laws pertaining to will training. And then I can get on another little rant around things like that, like the law of attraction, which, Assagioli's history is deep and rich, as we know. Long before he was looking into creating a psychology, he was exploring spirituality. But now we see little pieces of each of these things taken into the world, so that the whole idea of the law of attraction now has a very narrow and often selfish reality attached to it. If I want it, I can have it. Let me envision dollar signs and I'll be rich. And that always makes me sad. And yet what we're seeing is that these pieces of the puzzle that Assagioli had, again, as far as I'm concerned, he had a really incredibly whole view. Right.
And materialism exists so strongly in our culture anyway. It's so easy to get trapped by it.
Yep. Well, and we still are. I mean, the piece that Freud got right was, among other pieces, but was our fear of death. So, the more, what is the bumper sticker? The one with the most toys wins. So.
You mentioned integration, and in your experience, how important is it to distinguish, as Assagioli did, integration and synthesis?
Well, as he talks about that specifically in relationship to subpersonality work, I either think of synthesis as a process, not an outcome, or I don't think of synthesis at all. If I have to think of it as an outcome, I don't think of it, because there's no end point. I've been around long enough to know that the subpersonalities I first discovered, my very, very first subpersonalities, I still have them, but my relationship to them is very different. And the movement of the cyclical movement of expansion through the egg diagram, just coming of yourself at the lower unconscious, middle unconscious, higher unconscious level. We're going to revisit stuff. So for me, synthesis is again either always happening or it's never happening because there's no outcome. It is the process of evolution. If you think of, some people do the synthesis map with the three, the polarities, the balancing and synthesis of opposites, also Assagioli's. But what's inherent in that is not that you come to a synthesis that's an end, but that synthesis is then, then there's another.
Step.
So it's a never-ending process of evolution, and a spiral is the way that I think of it that works best for me.
I noticed in your office at home that you have, is that a rose? But it's certainly a spiral shell, it looks like, in the very center of that.
In the window seat?
In the window seat, right. What is that?
That is a shell, a nautilus type of shell.
Right.
And it's,
so beautiful.
It is beautiful.
It's the most beautiful stained glass I've
the stained glass you're thinking of. There's actually a shell. The stained glass, actually, the Raven training program groups gave me that. Wow. And so it was inspired. They had it made, and it was inspired out of psychosynthesis. Right. And I was really clear when I gave it to me that it wasn't going to stay in this building, but it was going to go to my home. And so it is.
Yeah, it's amazing. When you talked about this beautiful map that Assagioli conceived so many years ago and how that's evolving, how does that look now in your mind? Are you seeing the whole complete map you were referencing as being like an egg diagram, or what does it look like?
I don't think the egg diagram is, I think it's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's going to ever be something you can draw on paper that's going to be a description that's large enough to hold the real theory that Assagioli put together.
Mm-hmm.
What I see happening in the field at large is that different pieces of theory, different practitioners, psychosynthesis people are taking psychosynthesis into different places. So I'm actually very, very fond of the psychological function map. Mm-hmm. I think it's, in many ways, it's a richer map. And what we see in the field of psychology, now we see a lot of body work coming into its own, mm-hmm. not as a complementary tradition or something that you can do as an adjunct to therapy, mm-hmm. but using the body as the way in. So somatic experiencing, a lot of somatic work that, again, points to a map that Assagioli said, look at all of the functions. Mm-hmm. And yet, clearly, no single psychotherapist is going to be able to train sufficiently in every one of those maps, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or every one of those functions. So I love it when I see people, doing body work. They're taking one of the legs of the psychological function, one of the star points, and really fleshing it out. And other people work with imagination. We have a lot of art therapy mm-hmm. out there now. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's wonderful. It also, in my training program, it gives permission to for people to go towards their strength. Mm-hmm. And to take psychosynthesis out into the world into ways that I could never take it out. You're not going to see people in my office moving around a lot doing body work. But I also think that every one of the functions mm-hmm. Is a way in. Mm-hmm. And different ones are going to be a better fit for different people, both the practitioners and the clients. So I'm not sure I don't remember what your question was, but...
Well, that really addresses it right, because I think what I was asking was something for my imagination that is a visual image. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to ask you to back up and do it because you've already done it. Mm-hmm. You were really referencing more the star than the egg. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And... I don't know what the cameras see, but we have our own graphics on both the egg and the star diagram. So mm-hmm. there's our mandala of the star diagram, which to me, it's now also the cover of the Active Will, mm-hmm. The mm-hmm. most recently published version of that. So that just in it's evocative in its richness, and that's Claire Goodwin, who is mm-hmm. a psychosynthesist and mandala artist. Mm-hmm. And the lotus in the middle, what I visualize as the mm-hmm. lotus, also to me points to another one of Assagioli's concepts, which is the transpersonal qualities. Mm-hmm. And we also now have mandala evocative word cards, again out of Assagioli's evocative words. And I'll tell you another little thing that's moving. One of our trainees from a long time ago is now in the process of doing an entire composition called the Active Will Suite, and it's a jazz performance that goes through the 6 stages of the Active Will as the 6 movements of the Active Will Suite. It is in process, but I have watched in his rehearsals, and so it's pretty. And again, to me, that's the depth and breadth of mm-hmm. psychosynthesis, mm-hmm. that it invites a piece of music to be created out of it, that it invites a mandala artist to create mandalas mm-hmm. for the evocative words and for the maps, that it takes people into body work, etc.
I can't wait.
Well, I suggested that he try to get it together for the 2012 mm-hmm. conference mm-hmm. in
Wouldn't that be
Italy.
wonderful to give that as an offering there? Yeah. So it seems so many creative blossomings have come from the Synthesis Center, Didi.
When I talk about psychosynthesis, I'm actually I draw a lot from my bodily experience. I don't do body work with people. I don't use the body as an overt function, but the sensation experience, which is why I'm a martial artist too, is because that's the place that my body lives psychosynthesis. But as I said, my Zen, but also my martial arts, they grow out of the roots of psychosynthesis. For me, psychosynthesis is the taproot in my life.
Right, I hear that. And it's nourishing a lot of other people too, you know that, right? So, back to your martial arts. Could you describe what that is for you and how that works?
It's not entirely clear. Well, I know why I got into it. My husband, Ted, basically nagged me into trying it when he was doing it. But like so many things, he has had the inspiration. Pretty much, other than the children, which were always my inspiration, and he was resistant. Most of the big pieces of our life have been his inspiration. So we have this building. His encouraging me to train in psychosynthesis once I had this first moment with John, starting a training program, martial arts, Zen, every one of those things was his inspiration. So he is, in fact, the muse. In our particular world, he's the muse. And so he was doing the martial arts before his knee went bad, and he just encouraged me to come and join him, and I did. And what I found was it was the place. It is, and now we go to Assagioli's little known and little taught article on the 7 paths to self-realization. There's been a little back and forth on some of the boards about that lately because I teach it. It comes out of the 7 rays, basically. But it is an article he wrote, as far as I know. I got it from Martha Crampton in my early training. In which he talks about the different ways of self-realization. And then Ferrucci's book, Inevitable Grace, kind of follows some of those same principles. But for me, my martial arts helped me realize part of my path, which is the path of ritual and form, that the preciseness, the precision, the inner work of creating a kata and that kind of movement, that's what martial arts do for me. And my martial art, it's not a contact martial art, it's a solo kata, but it also has it has the warrior spirit in it because it comes out of the samurai tradition. So and you get to play with a sword. How many people get to play with swords? Not too many.
Right.
But I do.
How many people want to?
Oh, I don't know. I just would assume everyone would want to.
So when you mention the word kata, what is that in your understanding?
A kata in any martial art is a specific set of movements that are the form of some action that in another world would be an actual fighting action. Though in something like karate, the kata are the practice. It's like your scales in the piano. You do your scales not just randomly, but because then when you actually have the music in front of you, your fingers know how to do it. So the kata is the bodily form that embodies what the martial meaning military or live action art would be.
And so then when you're practicing, you are connecting with the significance of what the movements mean.
No, not actually. I'm connecting with the quiet of the disidentified place in which I move. For me, martial arts disengages me from thinking, which is my primary psychological function. And so, more easily than in meditation, it's a quiet space for me, and it's a relationship with self to body.
Right.
And it has a very transpersonal orientation in that regard. But it's just quiet, which is very nice.
So you're teaching these 7 functions in the work you're doing now?
Teaching the psychological...
The 7 rays, I think.
No, I don't go to anything esoteric.
Do that.
Esoteric means nothing to me. Never had an interest in it. Didn't bother me that Astro Jolie had an interest in it. I think it's not my thing to. I wouldn't want anybody to look at what I teach and try to assess it through my practice of Zen or my practice of martial arts or my mother. I want what I do to stand on its own. I think what Astro Jolie did in psychosynthesis stands on its own. And I don't have that curiosity or weird attachment to.
I'm curious about the paper you mentioned.
This is a paper, I'll give you a copy of it. It's specifically called The 7 Paths to Spiritual Realization. And it is written in psychosynthesis language. He talks about, and this is probably one where I won't remember all the paths, but he talks about just that self-realization coming right out of the maps that use self-realization, dimensions of growth and self-realization, that self-realization is different for different people, that there are different paths. So for some people the path is more aesthetic, that having beauty around them is very important, and that's the way into spirit. For other people it's scientific, and that's the way into spirit. For others it's ritual or devotional, and so he has elaborated those. And I do teach that as a fairly small piece of the training, but what is important about it for me is that, like everything else in his orientation, it is large, it is comprehensive. It's basically a way of saying there's no right way to do self-realization. And it's an invitation for us as practitioners to not get caught. It gives us a permission to see a larger world. So when I used to work at the Institute for Holistic Education with Jack Canfield, where we were all studying psychosynthesis together, he had a much more aesthetic view. So the way I think of it is that if we had an extra $50, he would want to plant a rose bush. I would want to give it to some political organization. This map is the map that helps us understand why, my version wasn't better than his version, or his version wasn't better than mine. That it's as likely to be through, any one of these forms as another that people are going to find their way. And it's interesting in that regard, with my kind of affinity towards some things Japanese. In World War II, Zen monks, some of them went and joined the military, and others went off into the mountains to meditate alone. And so that too was like it's just a place where we say there is no form that is right, and that the call of self is seen in a wide variety of ways. And we need to be able to see outside of our own version of reality and outside of our own call of self. If my path, looks like whatever it does, I don't want to stuff you, my client, or another culture or other people into my version of reality. I want to be able to step back and say, all men on all paths seek me. Some kind of biblical quote. I'm not very good with those.
From a period in time when it was men.
Yes.
Right. Well, I do want to get a copy of that paper. I'd love to see that.
I think maybe I've even had it typed into the computer, but I don't know for sure.